Her tiny hands were shaking as she clutched at the stranger's sleeve. Blood streaked down her cheeks like war paint, her voice breaking with every desperate word. "They're beating my mama. Please, she's dying." The room fell silent. Wine glasses froze midair. Every dangerous man in that restaurant turned. But the stranger she had chosen to beg was no ordinary man. He was Vincent Torino, the most feared mafia boss in Chicago, and what he did next would change everything. Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you breathless. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. It's a cold Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago, 1987. The Golden Palm restaurant hums with the familiar rhythm of power, well-dressed men conducting business over aged whiskey and hushed deals. Crystal chandeliers cast amber light across white tablecloths. Cigar smoke curls toward the ceiling like ghosts. This isn't just any restaurant. This is Vincent Torino's territory. Every waiter has been trained to see nothing and hear less. Every patron understands the invisible rules carved into the very walls. You keep your head down, you show respect, and you never, ever make a scene. Vincent Torino sits at his corner table, a fortress of a man whose slicked-back hair and cold, calculating gaze have built an empire that reaches across 3 states. At 53 years old, he's outlived most of his rivals. His dark eyes miss nothing. His decisions are final. His word isn't just law, it's the only law that matters on these streets. Tonight, like every Tuesday for the past 15 years, he's holding court with his most trusted lieutenants. The conversation flows in careful, measured tones. Territory lines are redrawn. Problems are dissected with surgical precision. Money changes hands beneath the table. This is Vincent's world. Controlled, calculated, completely without sentiment. Because Vincent Torino learned long ago that emotions were a luxury men like him couldn't afford. Sentiment was weakness. Attachment was vulnerability. And vulnerability got you killed, or worse, got the people you loved killed. For 30 years, he'd kept his heart locked behind walls of steel and concrete. For 30 years, no one had been allowed close enough to matter. But then, in the span of a single heartbeat, those walls would begin to crack. The restaurant's heavy oak doors exploded open with a violence that made champagne slosh in glasses. The maitre d' stumbled backward. A child's scream cut through the cigar smoke and careful conversation like a knife. And there she stood. 7 years old, pink dress torn and dirty, black hair wild around her shoulders, and on her small face, smeared across her cheeks like something from a nightmare, fresh blood, still wet and glistening under the chandeliers. Every conversation died. Forks clattered onto plates. The entire room held its breath as this tiny, trembling girl did the unthinkable. She ran straight toward Vincent Torino's table. What happened next would shake the foundation of Chicago's underworld and remind the city's most dangerous man what it meant to be human. Vincent's fingers drummed once against the white tablecloth, a subtle signal that made his Lieutenant Marco stop mid-sentence. The numbers were good, better than good. The dockyard operation had exceeded projections by 18%. The judge they'd cultivated was proving useful. 3 competitors had been quietly absorbed into their network without a single shot fired. This was how Vincent preferred to operate: clean, efficient, bloodless when possible. The Southside situation. Vincent's voice was low, barely above a whisper, yet it carried absolute authority. Tommy, the wrench Castellano, leaned forward, his scarred knuckles resting on the table. "Handled. The union boss understands our position now. We'll have no more trouble at the construction sites." Vincent nodded. No emotion flickered across his weathered face. He'd built this empire brick by brick, decision by decision, by eliminating anything that could be used against him. Attachment, loyalty that wasn't bought, love. All of it was poison in this business. He'd learned that lesson 30 years ago in the cruelest way possible. Maria's face still haunted him some nights. Her dark eyes, her gentle laugh, the way she used to braid flowers into her hair. But he'd locked those memories away in a vault so deep that most days he could pretend they'd never existed at all. The shipment from Miami arrives Thursday, Marco continued, sliding a leather folder across the table. Same terms as before, our contact says. Vincent. The voice belonged to Salvator, his head of security, who materialized beside the table like a shadow. His expression was carefully neutral, but Vincent caught the tension in his shoulders. What is it? Salvator hesitated, a bad sign. Men in their world didn't hesitate unless something was very wrong. Sir, there's a situation at the door. The maitre d' is trying to handle it, but... The doors exploded open. Vincent's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon holstered beneath his jacket, his body coiled and ready. His men around the table did the same, a synchronized response born from decades of survival. But what burst through those doors wasn't a rival gang, wasn't the police, wasn't any threat Vincent Torino had ever prepared for. It was a child. A little girl in a pink dress, her black hair wild and tangled, stumbled into the golden palm like a ghost crashing a funeral. Blood, fresh and crimson, was smeared across her small face in streaks that looked almost like war paint. Her chest heaved with desperate breaths. Her eyes were wide with terror. And before Vincent's bodyguards could move, before anyone could react, she did something that violated every unspoken rule of his carefully controlled domain. She ran straight toward him, her tiny hands outstretched, reaching for the most dangerous man in Chicago like he was her last hope in the world. Salvator moved first, his massive frame intercepting the child before she could reach Vincent's table. His hand shot out to grab her shoulder, but she twisted away with surprising agility, driven by pure desperation. Please, the word tore from her throat, raw and broken. Please, you have to help. Get her out of here, Marco hissed, already rising from his seat. Around the restaurant, other patrons shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch while hanging on every word. But the girl wouldn't be deterred. She ducked under Salvator's reaching arms and lunged forward, her small fingers catching the sleeve of Vincent's pristine black suit jacket. The contact sent a shockwave through the room. No one touched Vincent Torino uninvited. No one. Vincent's dark eyes locked onto the child's face. Up close, he could see the blood wasn't hers. It was spattered across her cheeks and forehead like she'd been standing too close to violence. Her brown eyes were swimming with tears that carved clean paths through the crimson. Sir, I'll remove her, Salvator said, reaching down again. Vincent raised one finger, just one. Salvator froze mid-motion. The little girl's entire body trembled against Vincent's arm. Her fingers clutched his sleeve with desperate strength, as if letting go meant drowning. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her pink dress torn at the hem, her shoes scuffed and dirty. They're hurting my mama, she choked out, the words tumbling over each other. The bad men, they came to our shop and they're hitting her and she's bleeding, and she told me to run but I can't leave her there, please, please you have to stop them. The restaurant had gone deathly silent. Even the kitchen noise had ceased. Every dangerous man in that room watched Vincent Torino to see how he would handle this unprecedented breach of protocol. Vincent should have signaled Salvator to remove her, should have returned to his meeting without a second thought. Children appeared in his world sometimes, usually as leverage, occasionally as collateral damage. You didn't get involved. You didn't let emotion compromise your judgment. Sentiment was weakness. But something in the child's eyes, that mixture of terror and desperate, impossible hope, struck a chord Vincent thought he'd severed 30 years ago. For just a moment, he saw another face. Another woman with dark hair who needed protection he couldn't provide. Where? Vincent's voice was quiet, controlled, giving nothing away. The little girl's eyes widened. She'd expected rejection, expected to be thrown out into the cold Chicago night. She hadn't expected the most feared man in the city to ask her a question. The flower shop, she gasped. On Ashland Avenue. Please, they said they'd kill her if she doesn't pay. She doesn't have the money, please. Her voice broke completely, dissolving into sobs that shook her tiny frame. Vincent stared down at this child who'd crashed into his world and shattered his carefully maintained walls. Around him, His lieutenants waited, confused and tense. What Vincent Torino did next would echo through Chicago's underworld for years to come. The year was 1957. Vincent Torino was 23 years old, hungry and ambitious, clawing his way up through the ranks of Chicago's underworld. He'd been good at it too, smart enough to avoid unnecessary violence, ruthless enough to command respect, careful enough to stay alive. Then he'd met Maria Delgado at a church wedding, of all places. She'd been arranging flowers at the altar, humming softly to herself, completely oblivious to the dangerous men filing into the pews. When she'd turned and smiled at him, a genuine smile, untouched by fear or calculation, something in Vincent's chest had cracked open. For 2 years, he'd kept her separate from his world. She knew what he did, knew the blood on his hands, but he'd promised her safety. Promised her a life insulated from the violence that paid for their home. She believed him. Worse, he'd believed himself. They were married in that same church where they'd met. Maria wore white lace and carried roses. Vincent wore his best suit and made silent promises to a god he wasn't sure existed. For 6 months, he'd actually thought he could have both, the empire and the woman, that he could build walls high enough to keep the darkness out. He'd been catastrophically wrong. The Calabrese family had been moving in on Vincent's territory, testing his defenses, probing for weakness. Vincent had responded with calculated force, nothing excessive, just enough to send a message. He thought it was over. But Giovanni Calabrese hadn't been interested in territory. He'd been interested in sending a different kind of message. Vincent could still remember every detail of that August evening. The humidity that made his shirt stick to his back. The smell of Maria's cooking drifting from their apartment kitchen. The sound of her laugh when he'd come through the door early, surprising her. He'd left for 20 minutes. 20 goddamn minutes to meet with a contact 3 blocks away. A routine check-in that couldn't wait. When he'd returned, their front door was ajar. The apartment was silent. And Maria. Vincent's hands had shaken as he'd found her in their bedroom, surrounded by the roses she loved so much. The Calabrese family had scattered petals across her body like a sick mockery of a funeral. They'd left a note pinned to her chest. This is what weakness costs. He'd held her for 3 hours before his men had found him. By then, the blood had dried on his hands, and something fundamental had broken inside his chest. Something that would never heal properly, like a bone that sets wrong and aches forever. The war that followed had been biblical in its brutality. Vincent had dismantled the Calabrese empire piece by piece, leaving Giovanni for last. When he'd finally found him, cowering in a warehouse basement, Vincent had made sure he understood exactly what it cost to touch Maria Torino. But revenge hadn't brought her back, hadn't filled the hollowness in Vincent's chest, hadn't made the silence of his apartment any less deafening. So he'd built walls. Thick, impenetrable walls constructed from ice and discipline, and the absolute rejection of anything that could be used against him. He'd eliminated every vulnerability, severed every attachment, buried every emotion so deep that most days he could pretend he was already dead inside. For 30 years, those walls had held. For 30 years, he'd been untouchable. Until a 7-year-old girl in a pink dress had grabbed his sleeve and begged him to save her mama. And for the first time in 3 decades, Vincent Torino felt those walls begin to crack. Vincent Torino did something he hadn't done in 30 years. Something so unexpected that Marco actually took a step backward, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon as if his boss had been replaced by an imposter. Vincent knelt. Slowly, deliberately, the most feared man in Chicago lowered himself until he was eye level with the trembling child. His knee touched the restaurant's polished floor, a gesture of vulnerability that sent ripples of shock through every man watching. Up close, Vincent could see the terror etched into every line of the girl's small face, could smell the copper tang of blood mixed with the floral scent that clung to her clothes, could feel the desperate tremors running through her tiny frame as she clutched his sleeve like it was the only solid thing left in her world. "What's your name?" Vincent's voice was quiet, stripped of the cold authority that usually accompanied every word. The girl hiccuped, trying to catch her breath between sobs. Dianna. Dianna. Vincent repeated it carefully, as if committing it to memory. How old are you? 7. The word came out barely above a whisper. Vincent reached up slowly, telegraphing the movement so he wouldn't startle her, and pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his jacket pocket. With surprising gentleness, he began wiping the blood from her face. The child flinched but didn't pull away, her brown eyes locked onto his with desperate hope. The men who hurt your mama, Vincent said, his voice still soft but taking on an edge that made his lieutenant straighten. How many were there? 3, Diana's chin trembled. They had these red snake tattoos on their necks. They said Mama owed them money, but she doesn't. She already paid last week. I saw her. Red serpents. Marco's voice was tight with recognition. Razor Rodriguez's crew. They've been running protection rackets in that neighborhood. Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Protection rackets. Scum who terrorized shopkeepers and families, who beat women for pocket change and called it business. They weren't part of his organization, weren't even worth his attention under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Vincent finished cleaning Diana's face and carefully folded the blood-stained handkerchief. Then he placed both hands on her small shoulders, holding her steady. Dianna, I need you to be very brave for a few more minutes. Can you do that? She nodded, tears still streaming down her now clean cheeks. Vincent stood, and the shift in his demeanor was instantaneous. The gentleness vanished, replaced by the cold, commanding presence that had built an empire. He turned to Salvatore, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Call Dr. Russo. Tell him I need him at the flower shop on Ashland Avenue immediately. Tell him to bring everything, surgical equipment, blood supplies, the works. If he asks questions, tell him Vincent Torino is asking. Salvatore blinked, clearly struggling to process the order. Sir, Dr. Russo is your personal. Now, Salvatore. The head of security pulled out his phone, already dialing. Vincent turned to Marco. Take 4 men, go to that flower shop. The woman inside doesn't get touched again, if those red serpent bastards are still there. His voice dropped to something darker than winter. Contain them. Don't kill them. I want them alive. Boss, Marco started, confusion written across his weathered face. That's an order. Vincent looked down at Dianna, who was watching him with those impossibly hopeful eyes. Eyes that reminded him of another woman who'd once believed he could protect her. He'd failed Maria, but maybe, just maybe, he could save this child's mother. He extended his hand to Dianna. Come on, we're going to get your mama. Vincent's black Lincoln Continental cut through the Chicago night like a blade. Dianna pressed against his side in the back seat. Salvatore drove with practiced urgency, while Marco followed in a second vehicle with 4 of Vincent's most trusted enforcers. The girl's small hand gripped Vincent's jacket, her knuckles white with tension. It's the one with the blue door, Dianna whispered as they turned onto Ashland Avenue. Mama painted it last spring. She said it looked like hope. The flower shop materialized in the headlights, a narrow storefront wedged between a laundromat and a closed deli. The blue door hung crooked on its hinges, one of its glass panels shattered. Through the broken window, Vincent could see the carnage inside. The cars screeched to a stop. Vincent was out before Salvatore could open his door, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon beneath his jacket. Marco and his men flanked him immediately, their own weapons drawn. Stay in the car, Vincent ordered Dianna. For once, the child obeyed, her terrified eyes visible through the window. Vincent pushed through the ruined door. The smell hit him first, crushed flowers and fresh blood, a sickening combination that made his stomach tighten. The shop had been beautiful once. He could see it in the careful arrangement of dried flower wreaths on the walls, the hand-painted signs advertising arrangements, the lovingly maintained displays. Now it looked like a tornado had torn through it. Vases lay shattered across the floor, their contents trampled into the tile. A vintage cash register had been knocked off the counter, coins scattered like dropped promises. Roses, dozens of them, were crushed under boot prints, their petals ground into the linoleum like bloodstains. And in the center of it all, propped against an overturned display case, was Alina. Dianna's mother was maybe 35, with the same dark hair as her daughter and a face that would have been beautiful if it wasn't swollen and bleeding. One eye was already purple, nearly swollen shut. Blood trickled from a split lip. Her flower print dress was torn at the shoulder. But she was conscious, and when she saw Vincent and his armed men enter her shop, she did something that surprised him. She didn't cower. She tried to stand, swaying dangerously, her hands raised in a desperate, protective gesture. "Please," she gasped through broken lips. "Please don't hurt Dianna. I'll get the money, I just need more time, please." "Ma'am," Marco moved forward carefully, holstering his weapon. "We're not here to hurt anyone, we're here to help." Alina blinked, confusion cutting through her pain. "What?" Vincent knelt beside her, the same way he'd knelt for Dianna. Up close, he could see the defensive wounds on her forearms where she'd tried to shield herself. Could see the bruises forming on her ribs. The red serpents hadn't just beaten her, they'd tried to break her. "Your daughter came to me," Vincent said quietly. "She asked for help." "Dianna," Alina's good eye widened with panic. "Where is she? Is she safe?" "She's in my car, unharmed." Vincent glanced around the destroyed shop, his jaw tightening. "How much did they say you owed?" $67, Alina's voice cracked. "I paid them last week $100 for their protection. But they came back tonight saying the price went up, that it's $150 now, every week, forever." $67. Vincent had men who spent more than that on lunch. The red serpents had destroyed a woman's livelihood and beaten her half to death over the cost of a decent bottle of wine. The sound of tires announced Dr. Russo's arrival. Vincent stood as the gray-haired surgeon rushed in, medical bag in hand, taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. "Get her stabilized," Vincent ordered. Then he turned to Marco, and his voice dropped to something cold and final. "Find them, all three. I want to know where the red serpents operate, where Razor Rodriguez sleeps, and every shopkeeper they've touched, by morning." The warehouse on the south side belonged to Vincent, one of dozens he owned across Chicago, used for storage, meetings, and occasionally dispensing justice. Tonight, it would serve the latter purpose. Carlos and Miguel had been easy to find. Red Serpent foot soldiers weren't exactly criminal masterminds. Marco's crew had located them at a dive bar 3 blocks from Alina's shop, celebrating their night's work with cheap beer and cheaper cocaine. Now they hung from chains bolted to the warehouse ceiling, their toes barely touching the concrete floor. Both men were conscious. Vincent had been very specific about that. He needed them awake for what came next. Vincent entered through the side door, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Salvador and Marco flanked him, while 2 more of his men stood guard by the entrance. The hanging men's eyes went wide with recognition and terror. "Please, Mr. Torino," Carlos stammered, his words slurring through a split lip. "We didn't know, we had no idea she was connected to you. Razor just told us to collect." Vincent raised one finger. Carlos fell silent immediately. "You beat a woman in front of her 7-year-old daughter," Vincent said, his voice conversational, almost pleasant. "Over $67. Explain to me the logic of that business decision." Miguel tried to speak, but only managed a whimper. A dark stain spread across the front of his jeans. Vincent walked slowly around them, hands clasped behind his back like a professor delivering a lecture. "See, I've been in this business for 30 years. I understand protection, real protection. You provide security, maintain order, and in return, people pay for peace of mind. It's a transaction. Both parties benefit." He stopped directly in front of Carlos. "But what you're doing isn't protection. It's extortion. It's terrorism. Your parasites bleeding dry the very community you claim to protect." "We were just following orders," Miguel gasped. "Razor said." "Razor Rodriguez," Vincent's voice hardened. "Where does he operate?" Carlos and Miguel exchanged desperate glances. Everyone in Chicago's underworld knew the code. You didn't rat out your boss. But everyone also knew that code applied to equals, to men who commanded respect. Vincent Torino wasn't asking as an equal. He was asking as an emperor addressing insects. "The garage," Carlos broke first. "Abandoned auto shop on Kedzie. That's where he runs things. Please, Mr. Torino, we'll leave town. You'll never see us again." "You're right about that." Vincent turned to Marco. "Break their hands, all the fingers. Then drop them at Mercy Hospital with a message for their friends. The Red Serpents are done collecting protection money. Anyone who continues this operation answers to me personally. If you're still watching, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's continue." Vincent headed for the door, then paused. "And gentlemen, if I hear you've touched another shopkeeper, another mother, another innocent person trying to make an honest living," he looked back over his shoulder, "they won't find enough of you to fill a shoebox." The sound of screaming followed Vincent into the Chicago night as he climbed into his Lincoln. He had one more visit to make tonight, and Razor Rodriguez was about to learn what real fear felt like. The abandoned auto shop on Kedzie Avenue looked exactly like what it was, a front for criminal operations. Rusted car parts littered the yard. The windows were blacked out. Two men stood guard at the entrance, smoking cigarettes and trying to look dangerous. They stopped trying when Vincent's convoy pulled up. 6 vehicles, 20 armed men, and Vincent Torino himself stepping out of the Lincoln like death incarnate. The guards' cigarettes fell from their mouths. One reached for his weapon. Salvatore had him disarmed and on the ground before his fingers touched the grip. "Tell Razor Rodriguez that Vincent Torino is here to discuss business," Vincent said calmly. "He has 60 seconds to present himself." The second guard scrambled inside. Vincent waited, counting silently. At 43 seconds, the garage's main door rolled open. Razor Rodriguez was exactly what Vincent expected, mid-30s, covered in tattoos, wearing enough gold chains to anchor a boat. A red serpent coiled up his neck, its fangs reaching toward his jaw. He projected confidence, swagger, the artificial bravado of a man who'd never faced real power. That confidence faltered when he saw Vincent's army. "Mr. Torino," Razor tried to sound respectful and failed. "This is unexpected. If my boys caused problems in your territory, I apologize. We can work something out." "Inside," Vincent interrupted. "Now." The garage's interior reeked of motor oil and marijuana. A card table sat in the center, surrounded by folding chairs and counting machines. Cash was stacked on a workbench, protection money, Vincent knew. Blood money squeezed from families who couldn't afford it. Vincent's men fanned out, securing the space. 3 more red serpents were inside, all trying to decide if they should fight or surrender. Salvatore's cold stare made the decision for them. "You've been running protection rackets in my city," Vincent said, pulling something from his jacket pocket. "Specifically on Ashland Avenue." "Those aren't your territories," Razor protested, some of his bravado returning. "We checked. Nobody claimed them. They're open game." "Nothing in Chicago is open game." Vincent unfolded the paper in his hands carefully. "Especially not flower shops run by single mothers." He held up the drawing Dianna had made while Dr. Russo treated her mother. Done in crayon on the back of a receipt, it showed 2 stick figures, one small, one large, holding hands. The large figure wore a black suit. Above them, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for saving my mama." Razor stared at the drawing, confusion replacing his swagger. "A 7-year-old girl ran into my restaurant tonight," Vincent continued, his voice soft and infinitely more dangerous than any shout. "She had her mother's blood on her face. Blood your men put there over $67. The color drained from Razor's face. "She drew this for me," Vincent said, placing the picture on the card table. "This child has more courage in her tiny finger than you have in your entire organization. She faced the most feared man in Chicago to save someone she loved. What have you ever faced, Razor? What have you ever protected besides your own cowardice? Razor opened his mouth. No sound came out. Vincent leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into the younger man's soul. Here! What's going to happen next? Vincent gestured to the stacks of cash on the workbench. How much is there? Razor swallowed hard. Maybe 15,000. Look, Mr. Torino, we can split it. 50-50. You take your cut and we'll clear out of. You misunderstand. Vincent's voice could have frozen water. I don't want your money, I want a list. Every shopkeeper, every family, every person you've extorted in the past 6 months. Names, addresses, amounts taken. Razor's eyes darted to his men, looking for support. They were all staring at the floor. I don't keep records like that. It's bad for business. Marco stepped forward and slammed a ledger on the table, the same ledger they'd found hidden in Razor's office safe. You keep excellent records, page by page. Every collection, every date, every amount. Vincent flipped the ledger open. The pages were filled with neat handwriting. Rodriguez Grocery, $120. Chen Laundry, $85. Morty Bakery, $200. Page after page of families bled dry, their desperation reduced to columns of numbers. Here, what's going to happen? Vincent said, his finger tracing down the list. You're going to return every cent, personally, with interest, 20% on top of what you stole. That's impossible, Razor's voice cracked. We don't have that kind of. Then liquidate. Vincent's tone suggested he was discussing the weather. Sell your cars, your jewelry, your grandmother's wedding ring if you have to. You have 72 hours. And if we refuse? Vincent's smile was colder than a Chicago winter. Carlos and Miguel are at Mercy Hospital right now. Ask them about the consequences of refusing me. He nodded to Salvador, who produced a thick envelope and dropped it on the table beside the ledger. There's $30,000. Consider it seed money. That covers Elena Martinez and the first dozen families on your list. Razor stared at the envelope like it might explode. My accountant will audit your returns, Vincent continued. Every family gets their money back, plus interest, plus a personal apology from you. Marco here will accompany you on these visits to ensure your sincerity. Marco cracked his knuckles. The sound echoed like gunshots in the garage. After that, Vincent said, the red serpents are dissolved. You don't collect protection money anymore. You don't run rackets. You don't so much as jaywalk in my city. You get legitimate jobs and you live legitimate lives, or you leave Chicago permanently. Those are your only 2 options. You can't just, Razor started. Vincent picked up Diana's crayon drawing from the table and held it in front of Razor's face. You beat a woman in front of her child over grocery money. You're lucky I'm giving you options at all. Most men who make me kneel on a restaurant floor don't live to regret it. The weight of those words settled over the garage like a burial shroud. 72 hours, Vincent repeated, turning toward the exit. My people will be watching, don't disappoint me. As Vincent's convoy pulled away into the night, Razor Rodriguez stood in his garage, staring at a crayon drawing and realizing that the most powerful gang in Chicago had just been dismantled by a 7-year-old girl. 6 months later, Vincent Torino sat in a place he never imagined he'd be, the small garden behind Elena's flower shop, sipping coffee while a 7-year-old girl showed him her latest crayon masterpiece. The shop had been rebuilt, better than before, actually. New displays, fresh paint, a security system that would make Fort Knox jealous, though Vincent had made sure it looked subtle. Elena had protested the renovations, insisting she could manage on her own. Vincent had simply written a check and walked away before she could refuse. This one is you, Dianna announced, holding up her drawing. She'd gotten better over the months. The stick figures were more detailed now, the colors more deliberate. And this is Mama, and this is me, and these are all the flowers you brought us. Vincent accepted the drawing with the same careful reverence he once reserved for contracts worth millions. It's beautiful, Dianna. Elena emerged from the shop carrying a tray of pastries, her bruises long-healed, her smile genuine. You know you don't have to come every Tuesday, Mr. Torino. I'm sure you have more important. Nothing more important than this, Vincent interrupted gently. And he meant it. Something had shifted that night when Dianna grabbed his sleeve. The walls Vincent had built so carefully, so deliberately for 30 years, they hadn't crumbled. But they'd developed cracks, and through those cracks, light had begun to seep in. The red serpents were gone. Razor Rodriguez had returned every cent, then left Chicago the day his 72 hours expired. The neighborhood on Ashland Avenue was thriving, shopkeepers no longer afraid, families no longer bleeding money to parasites. Vincent's reputation hadn't suffered. If anything, it had grown. But now it came with a new dimension. People didn't just fear Vincent Torino. They whispered about the Mafia boss who'd gone to war over a flower shop, who dismantled a gang over a child's tears. Mr. Vincent, Dianna tugged his sleeve, the same gesture that had changed everything. Can you help me plant these roses? Vincent looked at the small rosebush in her hands, and for a moment he saw Maria. Saw her braiding flowers into her hair, laughing in their kitchen, surrounded by petals. The memory didn't hurt quite as much anymore. Of course, he said, kneeling beside Dianna in the dirt. As Vincent Torino, the most feared man in Chicago, helped a 7-year-old girl plant roses in a garden behind a flower shop, he realized something profound. For 30 years, he'd believed that sentiment was weakness, that attachment was vulnerability, that love was the enemy of survival. He'd been wrong. Real power wasn't just about fear and control. It wasn't just about walls and weapons and winning wars. Real power was choosing who you protected and what you stood for. Real power was a child's faith that even the darkest man could be a hero. Real power was being strong enough to let your heart break, and then choosing to keep it open anyway. That was the moment when everything changed for Vincent Torino. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Vincent's position. Would you have helped Dianna? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.